A routine police escort turns into a catastrophic mistake when a white officer confidently hauls a black woman into court, only to realize she's not the defendant. The moment her true identity is revealed, silence grips the room, and the officer's face drains of color. But by then it might be too late to undo the damage. Have you ever witnessed someone realize their mistake too late? Let us know in the comments below. "Let's go, lady. Move." The officer's grip was firm, rougher than necessary, as he steered the black woman through the courthouse doors. His fingers dug into her arm, his badge gleaming under the artificial lights as he marched her forward with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times. His nameplate read Officer Brent Calloway, and if anyone had told him that today would be the most humiliating day of his career, he would have laughed in their face. Jasmine Carter, the woman he was dragging, kept her face unreadable. Let him think he had control. Let him think he was winning. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing calm. She had faced men like him before. Men who saw her skin first, then built a whole narrative around it before she even opened her mouth. "Officer, there's a misunderstanding," she said smoothly, her heels clicking on the marble floors as they neared the security checkpoint. Calloway scoffed. "Yeah, I'm sure there is. Save it for the judge." He didn't even bother looking at her as he guided her past the line of onlookers, his grip tightening, his stance wide. Authority, control, power. He liked the way those things felt when he held them in his hands. The courthouse was buzzing with its usual morning chaos. Lawyers pacing, defendants waiting, bailiffs keeping order. But something was different. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd as Calloway shoved his suspect forward, their murmurs growing louder. People knew. People recognized her. Wait. Is that? No, it can't be. A young court clerk shot out of her chair, nearly dropping her files. A public defender, mid-conversation, turned on his heel, eyes widening. Even the security officers at the checkpoint stiffened, their gazes darting between the woman and Calloway. But Calloway didn't notice. He was too busy patting himself on the back. "All right," he said gruffly, reaching for his radio as they approached the front desk. "Got another one for holding." Before he could finish, a heavy voice cut through the air. "Officer Calloway." The entire room seemed to inhale. Judge William Hensley. The man's presence alone was enough to freeze the entire courthouse. His robes were still perfectly pressed from his last session, and the way he stood, unshaken, dominant, left no room for nonsense. A man of precision, of respect, of history. A man who had seen the world move forward and backward all at once. Jasmine finally exhaled, but her expression never changed. Calloway, on the other hand, turned stiff as a board. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, straightening his posture. Judge Hensley's sharp, dark eyes flicked to the woman standing beside him. Then, slowly, methodically, back to Calloway. "Do you know who this is?" The judge's tone was not raised, yet it carried the weight of a gavel slamming down on a verdict. Calloway's brow furrowed, then lifted. He turned to Jasmine for the first time, really seeing her. The power in her stance, the quiet fire in her gaze. Something clicked, but the realization was still sluggish, too slow to stop what was already in motion. Calloway faltered, his grip on her arm suddenly feeling wrong. He let go, as if burned, as if her skin was a flame licking at his fingers. The judge leaned forward slightly, his voice dipping low. "This is Federal Prosecutor Jasmine Carter." Silence. A deep, stretching silence that swallowed the courtroom whole. The security guards at the checkpoint exchanged glances. A court reporter covered his mouth to stifle a breath. A woman in a suit standing by the elevator muttered, "Oh, hell no," under her breath. Calloway's face went blank, and then he paled. Jasmine Carter was not a defendant. She wasn't even a witness. She was one of the most formidable federal prosecutors in the state, a woman who had sent countless criminals to prison, a woman whose name commanded instant respect in every legal room she stepped into. And this fool had just manhandled her like she was a common suspect. The humiliation started from his stomach, churning upward, heating his ears, reddening his cheeks. His mouth opened slightly, searching for words that didn't exist. Jasmine adjusted her sleeves, smooth, unbothered, but there was an edge to her voice when she finally spoke. "I was just telling the officer there was a misunderstanding," she said, coolly. Judge Hensley's gaze never left Calloway. "It appears so." Calloway took a half step back, his tongue suddenly too thick, too dry. I thought—" "What exactly did you think?" the judge asked, his voice a razor's edge. And Calloway knew. There was no talking his way out of this. Jasmine, for the first time, let her lips curve into a slow, deliberate smirk. She wasn't angry. Not yet. No, she was watching him stew, letting him marinate in his own mistake. He had arrested the wrong black woman. And now he had to face the consequences. Calloway could feel his pulse hammering against his throat. The silence was suffocating, and every pair of eyes in the courtroom bore down on him like a weight he could not escape. His fingers twitched at his sides as he fought the urge to adjust his belt, his badge, anything to make himself feel anchored. But there was no grounding himself in this moment. Jasmine Carter, federal prosecutor, not a defendant, stood before him with an air of quiet control, her expression unreadable, but her presence undeniable. The reality of his mistake sat thick in the air between them. "Officer Calloway," Judge Hensley's voice came measured, the kind of tone that promised nothing good would follow. "I assume you have a reason for bringing Ms. Carter into my courtroom in this manner." Calloway swallowed, but his throat remained dry. He started, then caught himself. Think fast. He was used to being in control of these situations, used to standing taller, speaking louder, holding the authority in his hands. But not now. Not here. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke again. "There was a misunderstanding." Jasmine's brow lifted ever so slightly, her lips pressing together as though she were holding back a laugh. Judge Hensley exhaled, his patience wearing thin. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, as if testing the words on his tongue. "Would you care to elaborate, officer?" The room was a pressure cooker. The courtroom clerks had gone still. Even the defendants, waiting for their hearings, sat up straighter, eyes darting between Calloway and the judge, like spectators at the edge of a battlefield. Calloway shifted, feeling his uniform constrict around him. "I was under the impression that Miss Carter was a suspect. She matched a description from a previous case, and You assumed," Judge Hensley finished for him. The words sliced through the air. Jasmine's arms folded across her chest. "How interesting," she mused, her voice light but laced with something cold. "Tell me, Officer Calloway, what exactly was the description you were working from?" He hesitated. "Go on," Judge Hensley prodded. "I'm sure we'd all love to hear." Calloway's jaw clenched, his mind racing for an escape route. Say the wrong thing and it gets worse. Say nothing and it gets worse. He cleared his throat. "A black female, mid-30s, professional attire." Jasmine's smile was slow and knowing. "Ah, so you saw a black woman in a suit and assumed she was your suspect." "I was just doing my job," Calloway forced out. "No," Judge Hensley said, his voice like a gavel coming down. "You were abusing your job." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Calloway's face burned. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be here, standing in front of a judge like some rookie who had just learned how to fasten his badge. Judge Hensley turned toward Jasmine. "Miss Carter, do you wish to make a formal complaint?" Calloway's stomach twisted. Jasmine tapped a manicured finger against her forearm, eyes never leaving him. "Not yet," she said after a pause, letting the words settle over him like a blade hovering just above the skin. "I'm more interested in how the department plans to handle this." Calloway's breath hitched. Judge Hensley nodded slowly, as if considering. That is an excellent question, one that I imagine will require some very uncomfortable conversations at the precinct. He then turned back to Calloway, his gaze sharper than steel. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done, officer? Calloway stiffened. It was a mistake. Judge Hensley let out a short, humorless chuckle. A mistake? Oh no, officer. A mistake is when you misfile paperwork. A mistake is when you forget to sign a report. His voice hardened. What you did was a choice. You saw a black woman and decided she was guilty before you even knew her name. Calloway wanted to argue, wanted to protest, but how could he? Jasmine tilted her head slightly. You know, officer, she said, I spend my days in court prosecuting criminals, real ones, the kind that prey on people, the kind that take lives. And yet, despite all that experience, I walked into this courthouse today in cuffs. Not because of anything I did, but because you looked at me and saw something I wasn't. Her words were careful, controlled, but underneath them was a fire. Calloway clenched his jaw, forcing himself to meet her eyes. Judge Hensley studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. I will be speaking with your precinct, Officer Calloway. You can be assured of that. The weight of those words settled in his chest like a brick. Jasmine stepped forward then, just close enough that only Calloway could hear her next words. You should be grateful, officer, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If I wanted to, I could end your career today. She didn't linger, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her anger. Instead, she turned, smoothing down her sleeves as though shaking off the entire encounter, and walked away. Judge Hensley watched her go, then turned his gaze back to Calloway. I suggest you think very carefully about what you've done today, he said, voice low and steady, because I promise you, this is not the kind of mistake that people forget. The courtroom was still as Calloway stood there, his whole world unraveling around him. He had walked in feeling powerful, and now he felt small. Calloway sat in the precinct's conference room, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavy. He had been in this seat before, when he first joined the force, when he was still wide-eyed and eager, before the badge became more about power than responsibility. But this time was different. Across from him sat Captain Ronald Graves, a no-nonsense man with deep lines of disappointment etched into his face. To his right, Internal Affairs Investigator Lisa Grant, her expression unreadable as she flipped through the thick file in front of her. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, the only sound in the room apart from the occasional scratch of a pen against paper. I've read the reports, Grant finally said, her voice smooth but firm. I've watched the security footage. I've spoken to witnesses. Now, Officer Calloway, I need to hear it from you. Walk me through your thought process. Calloway's jaw tensed. He swallowed. I thought she was a suspect. Grant's eyebrow lifted. You thought a federal prosecutor was a suspect? Calloway's stomach churned. I didn't know who she was. No, Graves said sharply, leaning forward. You didn't care who she was. Silence pressed against him like a vice. You had no warrant, no probable cause, no actual crime, yet you dragged a black woman through a courthouse like she was nothing more than another case on your belt, Grant continued, flipping another page in her folder. So, let me ask you, Officer Calloway, what exactly made you so sure she was guilty? He exhaled through his nose. She matched a description. A black woman in professional attire. Yes, that's it? His jaw clenched. Yes. Grant's gaze was piercing. Do you realize how that sounds? He knew. He knew exactly how it sounded. But acknowledging it meant acknowledging everything else. Graves leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as though the whole situation physically exhausted him. Do you understand the damage you've done? Not just to yourself, Calloway, but to the department? We are already walking a thin line with the public. Do you think this makes it better?" Calloway stayed silent. "You embarrassed us," Graves continued, his voice low and sharp. "You embarrassed me, and more importantly, you embarrassed yourself." The weight of those words hit him harder than he expected. "You've got a history, Calloway," Grant said, flipping another page. "Several complaints for unnecessary aggression, racial profiling, questionable stops, nothing that stuck. Until now." Calloway's head snapped up. "None of those were proven." "No," she said, her lips pressing together. "But you think it's a coincidence that all those misunderstandings involve the same demographic?" He felt his throat tighten. "Tell me, officer," Grant pressed, her voice razor-sharp. "If Miss Carter had been a white woman in a suit, would you have done the same thing?" His gut reaction was to say yes, to defend himself, to insist that he wasn't the man they were painting him to be. But his hesitation answered for him. Grant leaned back, nodding as though she had been expecting that very silence. "This is what's going to happen," Graves said, voice steady but firm. "Internal Affairs is officially recommending a suspension while we conduct a full review. You will surrender your badge and weapon today." Calloway stiffened. This is too much," he forced out. "It was a mistake. I've been an officer for years. Graves shook his head. "And that makes it worse. You should know better." Grant slid a form across the table toward him. "Sign." His hands felt like lead as he picked up the pen. The ink bled onto the paper, the weight of the moment sinking into his bones. He was no longer Officer Calloway. He was just Brent Calloway. Jasmine Carter stood outside the courthouse, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The world kept moving, as it always did. Cases still needed to be prosecuted, people still needed to be held accountable, and yet there was something deeply satisfying about today. "Carter?" She turned to find Judge Hensley approaching, his expression softer than before. "Your Honor," she greeted with a small nod. "Hell of a day," he said, standing beside her, watching the traffic hum past. She let out a small chuckle. "Yeah, you could say that." Hensley studied her for a moment. "You had every right to press charges." She nodded. "I know." "So why didn't you?" She exhaled, folding her arms. "Because ruining his career isn't enough. He needs to sit with what he's done. Losing his badge is one thing, but knowing that he was the problem? That's a different kind of punishment." Hensley hummed, considering her words. "You're a smart woman, Jasmine Carter." She smiled. "I try." He nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "If you ever want a seat on the bench, let me know." She laughed, shaking her head. "Not yet. Too much unfinished business in the courtroom." Hensley gave a knowing nod before stepping away, disappearing into the courthouse once more. Jasmine looked out at the city, letting the moment settle. One less bad cop on the streets. It wasn't justice, but it was a start. Brent Calloway sat in his apartment, staring at his badge on the kitchen counter. It was no longer pinned to his chest, no longer a source of authority. It just lay there, a meaningless piece of metal stripped of everything it once represented. His apartment felt different now, smaller, quieter, like the walls were closing in on him. The TV was off, the room dim, and the only sound was the faint hum of traffic outside his window. His phone buzzed. A text. "Grayson, man, what the hell happened?" Calloway ignored it. He had already received a dozen messages from his colleagues, some offering support, others distancing themselves, pretending they had never known him. The news had spread fast. Suspended pending investigation. No gun. No badge. No uniform. He wasn't even sure if he could be a cop again after this. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he deserved to. His mind replayed everything, over and over. The way Jasmine Carter had looked at him. The way the judge had dismantled him with just a few words. The way his own silence had condemned him when they asked if he would have done the same to a white woman. The answer had been there all along, buried under years of arrogance, years of justifying bad instincts with words like procedure and protocol. He had always told himself he was just doing his job, just keeping the streets safe. But who was he keeping them safe from? His gut twisted. He pushed himself up from the couch, pacing. He needed air. He grabbed his keys, out of habit, not necessity. There was no squad car waiting for him outside, just his own aging sedan, parked on the street like any other civilian. It felt strange, walking out of his apartment without the weight of a gun at his hip, without the radio clipped to his shoulder. Just a man. Just Brent Calloway. As he drove, he didn't have a destination in mind. He just needed to go, to move, to feel something other than the crushing reality of what he had done. The city lights blurred past. It was different when you weren't patrolling, when you weren't looking for reasons to stop someone, reasons to ask questions. For the first time, he was just another face in the crowd. His hands tightened around the wheel. He didn't like the feeling. After a while, he found himself outside a quiet cafe. He had driven here without thinking, as if some part of him had led him here on its own. Through the window, he saw her. Jasmine Carter. She was sitting alone, a coffee in front of her, scrolling through something on her phone, untouched, unbothered, free. Calloway hesitated. He shouldn't be here, he knew that, but before he could talk himself out of it, his feet were moving. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. Jasmine didn't look up at first, too focused on whatever she was reading, but then, as if sensing his presence, her eyes flickered upward. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked expectant. He approached the table, but he didn't sit. They presume he had the right. Jasmine sighed, setting her phone down. "You lost?" His throat felt tight. He shook his head. A beat of silence. Then he spoke again. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Jasmine studied him, her expression unreadable. "For what, exactly?" Calloway exhaled. "For assuming, for not thinking, for treating you the way I did." Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. "You think that changes anything?" "No," he admitted. "But it's the truth." Jasmine nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "You know," she said, leaning back, "I've dealt with men like you my whole career. The ones who think their badge gives them the right to decide who belongs where, who's guilty before they even open their mouths." Calloway looked away, shame settling heavy in his chest. "But," she continued, "I've also seen people change, not because they got caught, not because they were forced to, but because they finally saw themselves for who they really were, and they didn't like what they saw." Calloway's jaw clenched. "And you think that's me?" Jasmine tilted her head. "I don't know. Is it?" The question cut deeper than he expected. He had spent years believing he was the good guy, the one who kept order, who made things safer. But now he wasn't sure. "I don't want to be that guy anymore," he said quietly. Jasmine studied him for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small notepad. She scribbled something down and slid it across the table. "Community initiative," she said. "They work with former officers, people trying to undo the damage they've done. They could use someone who actually wants to learn." Calloway stared at the paper. "This isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card," she warned. "It's a start, if you're serious." He took the note, feeling its weight in his hands. "Why are you giving me this?" Jasmine shrugged. "Because I'd rather see you learn than watch you become another bitter ex-cop who thinks the world is against him." He swallowed hard, nodding. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he admitted. She smirked. "Good, because I don't." But there was something else in her eyes. Not warmth, not friendship, but possibility. A challenge. Calloway took the paper, sliding it into his pocket. He had lost his badge. But maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost himself.